Hey everyone, welcome to the Gear Priority Podcast. Today we are going to be trying to answer the question of what fabric is best for tents. Most people are likely familiar with nylon tents like the MSR Hubba Hubba or the Big Agnes Copper Spur, which are both made from nylon. And nylon is probably the most used fabric at the moment for tents. But because it's the most popular and used by some of the biggest manufacturers, does that make it the best tent fabric? Today, I'm going to be chatting and picking the brain of Dan Durston with Durston Gear about the different fabrics for tents, the pros and cons of each, and where he thinks the sweet spot is for tent design. Dan has decades of experience backpacking and has been designing gear since the early 2000s. He's probably best known for the X-Mid series of tents. And while some of you might know that Dan's a bit of a gear nerd, I don't think most people know how deep that goes. I've come across essays written by Dan's on various forums and deep parts of the internet about gear design and material choice. Gear isn't just a job or even a hobby for Dan. Based on what I've seen, it's a passion and maybe even an obsession. But I'll let Dan answer that question. Hi Dan, thanks for joining me. And would you go as far as to say that gear is an obsession for you?
My wife would say that, yeah.
Yeah. What aspect, like, your tent was one of the first things that you designed, and I think if you go back in history, was that one of the first kind of make your own gear projects that you had? Was that a tent or tent-like object?
Yeah, I've always just been so picky on, I'm just so picky that when I get a piece of gear, I'm modifying it right away. And then I did make a tent, totally different than our current tents, but I did make a tent back in 2008, roughly 2009, out of Dyneema. And I was making kind of all this different stuff. All of it pretty bad, but it was kind of what it was.
Yeah, I think it's probably the base that you had to kind of, and the sequence that you had to go through to get to where you are now, where I think the X-Mid's probably one of the most popular tents out there and has a pretty cult-like following. Every time I make a video on my YouTube channel about a non-X-Mid tent, 50% of the comments are, What about the X-Mid? Why are you talking about the X-Mid? So it's...
Yeah, it's not even remotely related. It's best hammock. Why isn't the X-Mid here?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm looking forward to chatting with you about tents and tent fabric. I have a few rapid fire questions just to kind of get us going into the podcasting mood and maybe have people kind of get to know you a little bit more. And first one being, we're just going to go through these quickly. First one being, what's your favorite non-backpacking outdoor activity?
Rock climbing.
Rock climbing? Nice.
Yeah.
And have you ever had someone from the Durston cult show up at your house unannounced?
Not at the house.
Not at the house?
A little bit, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, almost. There's been some people that come to our house that I said could come, but I totally forgot I said it. And then just oh, hey.
I was always wondering about that because I think it's a pretty tight-knit community, and I feel like you've probably gotten pretty close with some of the people who are big fans of the products. What's your favorite color?
I like greens for sure, and within green, I'm known for the sage.
Yeah,
it's got to say sage, or the hint of blue in there too.
Okay, so it is. I was wondering about that. That's why I asked the question. I wasn't sure if the tent color choice was just kind of cool color, or if it was based in your personal preferences for color. So that's cool to know.
Yeah.
What about biggest phobia?
Oh, I had claustrophobia. Oh my God, I have a winter sleeping bag that's so tight. I ripped the snap on it because I was just can't calm myself down.
Nice. And toilet paper or backcountry bidet?
I'm a toilet paper guy. I haven't tried the bidet one of these years.
Yeah, if I'll come visit you in the shop and I'll bring you a little bidet. And I moved over to it this year and it's changed my life. I think it just feels so much cleaner. Yeah,
I could see that. It's on some of the big events. You got to really get some water in there. It's gotta be a problem.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. All right, so jumping into the discussion here about tent fabrics and the different fabrics that are used in tents and what might be the best options. I think one of the first things I want to talk about is kind of differentiating between fabrics and fibers. So would you be able to kind of just run us through what the main tent fabrics are that are used for tents right now, and then how that differs from like a tent fiber.
Yeah, so for fibers, historically it wasn't much of a conversation because it was just nylon and everything was nylon. You didn't even think about it. There always was polyester. We can get into this a bit more later, but polyester wasn't, well, it was used in heavier tents. It's a big backstory, but there's nylon, there's polyester, and then there's like new kind of modern techie fibers. The main one, the name is terrible. Like it's ultra high molecular weight polyethylene. Brand names like Dyneema, Spectra, Ultra. Ultra is kind of a handy short word. I just call it Ultra.
Yeah.
That's a new one. And then there are other fibers that are not really used in tents, but could be, like Kevlars, aramid fibers. They're just like fibers. You can kind of, I mean, you could like cotton, like you could make a tent out of anything. They just
True. Well, I think that there's some winter tents that are essentially made from, like, they're made from canvases, right? So it's
right.
I think we probably don't see those quite as much, but would you say like nylon, polyester, and then we'll call it ultra slash
Right.
like these. I think most people are probably familiar with the brand, the Dyneema brand.
Yeah, you call it Dyneema, and then that like the Dyneema fibers that go into Dyneema composite fabric.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's kind of dive into like we have those fibers, and then what makes like how would you get to like the fabric point for actually being able to make it into a tent?
Yeah, so there's just a lot more to it than you would think, because you kind of just think, oh, well, like fibers, you weave them together, fabric. You don't always have to weave them together. Like that's the thing with Dyneema composite fabric is it's not woven. They're just kind of laid out and glued inside a composite. So your traditional fabric, you weave them. That's still going to have all sorts of variables besides the fiber, because you're going to have like how tight you're weaving it, all the different coatings, like your main waterproof coatings, your like kind of minor coatings like water repellents, fire retardant coatings. There's so many variables. I think some of us are going to get into a bit later too, but there's all the conditions of the process, like the tension on the threads, the heat. So much goes into it besides just the fibers. But basically you take the fibers and some coatings, you put them together, usually weaving, but you could lay them out in a kind of a glued sandwich.
Okay, so like would you say kind of like the fiber then would be the kind of like base material, and then kind of like, and then the fabric is the product that's made, like just kind of put all together as like the finished product?
Yeah, the fibers are like threads is maybe like kind of a way of thinking of them. They're not necessarily a thread, like they could be like an actual fiber, like a solid piece. Some like threads are still typically like actually fibers woven together. But so you'd probably take fibers and weave them into threads, and then you'd weave threads into fabrics. But they're a little nerdy.
Nice. Well, that's what we're all about. So that's good to know, because I think a lot of people probably just think like this all nylons are created equal, like all polyesters, all Dyneema, they're all created equal, maybe like some different weights, kind of thing. But it sounds like there's a lot more that kind of goes into it, and yeah, we'll kind of dive into that a little bit here. Do you have like as far as just like the difference between like fiber and fabrics, do you have like a simile or metaphor that you could give us, like what it's something that it's like?
Yeah. Well, I shouldn't say yeah too quick, because I'm maybe I don't. But I mean, like a visual metaphor, like on my shirt, you can see the colors, and those are all like they're the threads, which are, you could kind of think of like the fibers, and then the shirt is the fabric.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I guess like how do we end up at these fibers for tents? Like I assume there's a lot of other types of fibers out there, and you kind of alluded to that, like we see with like cotton and like Kevlar, some other ones out there. But like why nylon and kind of like polyester and Dyneema?
There probably are fibers that are amazing and that nobody uses, because there's a critical step, which is commercialization. And a lot of these fibers date back to World War II, when like maybe the military wanted to make parachute. I think I'm a little hesitant. There's like all these stories about how everything started, and you're like, is that really how it happened? But I don't know what's true. But the story on the street is like a lot of these came out of World War II. And the chemists in the lab, they figure out a fiber, and then you need an application that's going to hit critical mass, whether it's like military or whatever it is. And so nylon and polyester really, around World War II anyways, really got big. And then because of that, they're available as a fabric and we can look at them and consider them for tents. There's probably all these other great like fibers that are not used necessarily in a fabric. You could use a fiber in like, I don't know, a lot of weird like technical applications, probably get a membrane or in like you could put a fiber, just like mix it in to like reinforce an epoxy. And it wouldn't be anything like a fabric. It'd be like a fiber in like a hard thing. Like maybe like a bowling ball, those big bowling balls that are all swirled colors. Like maybe they like stir fibers in there and it like has no resemblance to a fabric. It's a bowling ball. So anyways, there are like a million, because there's like it's chemistry. There's a million ways you can put molecules together. You're always going to have different properties. And a lot of them are maybe good, but we just like never hit that commercialization step where you would even, because it's so hard to like take the jump from like a fiber to lab to like millions of meters of this stuff coming out affordably.
When you're sourcing fabrics for the tents, was it really like tents made, like fabrics made for tents, or was it like you were looking at fabrics that are made for other things and then brought into the tent world?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when you start, there's kind of a hierarchy. If you're like a make your own gear person, you're going to go to like a website that sells like camping gear fabrics. And then when you go a level deeper and you're actually manufacturing tents, you're going to start getting your fabrics from the factory, and there'll be like a tent factory. So they'll all be kind of presented as tent fabrics. And that's pretty good. Like they got some good ones. Obviously they wouldn't kind of have them. They'd be like, oh, these are like the 10 fabrics we like to work with or something like that, because they're all pretty good. And then if you go a step deeper, you're actually going to fabric mills. And then they actually make the fabrics. They have a lot more control. They can make it different ways. And they would be producing for a wide range of applications. Like Dyneema composite fabric, it started in sales.
Have you gone that deep, like to the mills and chatted, like talked with them, or does like the factory kind of usually act as the kind of middleman in that scenario?
We're kind of on that boundary. I still, like right now, I'm looking at fabrics from the factory, but then I'm also starting to talk to mills. I've got somewhere around here. I got a cool. Yeah, I got the Dye Home Teams. This is where Tarp 10 and Mount Laurel Designs get all their fabric. They emailed me. They're like, "We make the best." I was like, "Wow, I should see if it's the best." Anyways, I haven't tested it yet, but got some. So anyways, yeah, we are talking to mills, and that's a nice when you want to get into customization, which I think the problem for a lot of people there is the minimums are going to be really high. So if you just want to make a tent or even 100 tents, like it's like they're not going to, they might have something they could sell you off the shelf, but it's not really like, you may as well just get it from the factory.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think when you kind of came out with the X-Mid, I think like polyester tents made with polyester weren't, they're kind of, there's tents out there, but I think you kind of alluded to it earlier. A lot of them were kind of heavier, more budget targeted tents, whereas I think the X-Mid really brought polyester fabric to the forefront of people's minds as kind of like, this is a performance tent fabric. And I was kind of curious what your thoughts are on like what makes like a good fabric for tents, and like then we can kind of get into some of the trade-offs, I think, between like the main tent fabrics. But when you're looking at which fiber and which fabrics to use for the X-Mid, just what got you on, like what got you to polyester?
Yeah, so there's some basic considerations that you're always thinking about. There's like strength. Everyone gets super fixated on strength, and it is important. For a trekking, like my tent is a trekking pole tent, so it sets up with your trekking poles, and that means that the canopy is actually part of the structure. If the canopy's loose, the poles are wiggling around, the whole thing's structurally unsound. So for me, when I was reading about materials and you talk about, and you come across the information that nylon essentially expands when it's wet, and that makes these tents loose, and polyester doesn't. That sounds like a pretty huge differentiator on like how how structurally sound the shelter is going to be. It's one danger with all of this is that people get really passionate and like little differences get blown up. Like one fabric's 10% stronger than another, and it's like, you're going to die with this one. This one's amazing, and this one's going to die. Like words like that. So I was drawn to polyester for the non-sag reason, and then I started looking at some of the critiques of it, and I was finding that they didn't really hold a lot of weight. There was some critiques were talking about how nylon was like 3 times stronger and things like that. And you look into it, and it like this kind of okay. Here's the other big problem with all this: is it actually getting good information is like super hard.
That's something that I've encountered too. Sorry, but it's I deal with a lot of different manufacturers of different tents and things like that, and I ask them, like, do you have specs on your fabrics and your fiber, like on your fabrics that you're using? And a lot of them don't. They don't know, other than the kind of very basic numbers, like you said, like what's the strength is, what the tear resistance is, all these kind of things that I think are important for fabrics. And that's what you're finding when you're looking at fabrics as well.
Yeah, so you've got kind of two sources. You got tests on fibers and tests on fabrics, and there's not a lot of tests on fibers. Like when you actually go to like people that make them, like I'm not going to take like a fiber, like a single thread, and have like the machinery to test like the strength of one filament. Or, like, I mean, you could, but like, you'd be like, it's like you'd be an academics essentially at that point. So a lot of the information on fibers is from the literature, which is okay, which is fine, except there's actually not that much. And a lot of it is really confounded with a lot of other variables. And then when you look at the fabrics, there is like, everybody thinks of it too simple. It's like, oh, this one's nylon, this is poly. Maybe you consider like the size of the threads, like the denier. There's like so many factors that like the thread count and how the heat and all these things. So you could know if a fabric's good or bad, but to say why that is, to be like, oh, it's because of the polyester, and or is it because of the coating, or because of the fire retardant, or because they put a UV treatment, or because they calendared it, or like you can't just like, that's the problem, is like you test like one fabric and then you know if it's good, but you don't know why it's good or bad, whatever it is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think you just listed off about 6 or 7 different factors other than the fiber type that affect the fabric, which I think like some of those I've heard about before, but I think a lot of the time, like you said, people are talking about fabrics just in terms of what the fiber is without really looking at all those other factors and then coming to conclusions on how they're going to perform. And I think that's something that I was kind of curious about. Like, I think you just listed off a bunch. What would you say the most like important, like other than fiber, what the other important factors are when like building a fabric for tents specifically?
Maybe one kind of useful bit of background here would just be if I just summed up the fibers a little more, so we got nylon, poly, and like Dyneema. So actually I'll move 2 steps back. Okay, so here's what you would want for a tent. If you just could like have the perfect thing, you would want it to be as strong as possible. You would want it to, like, the main things would be like strength, basically. And then also stretch. People argue different ways, but I think generally you want almost nothing, because there's going to be more stretch anyways when you weave it, and that's probably enough. So you want almost nothing. And then you've got kind of medium considerations like UV resistant. And then there's a whole bunch of small considerations like how slippery it is. It affects not just slippery, but how well the weave's going to hold, how well it holds dyes, how well it takes coatings, things like that. So that's kind of what you'd want, is you'd want it to be like super strong and not stretch, and then like be good at UV and all these different things. When we actually compare our 3 fibers to this, nylon does pretty well for strength, but the chemistry fundamentally is hydrophilic. There's these amide bonds. I'm not like a chemist, but there's amide bonds that are, the polarity attracts water. They actually absorb water. It swells. So it's not the same thing as stretch. Like fibers can stretch like an elastic band. These like swell, so they stay big. And that can happen by about 4%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if a tent is like 150 inches over the arc of it, that's 6 inches of slack, which is like a ton. Now it's hard to actually get that to happen. That would take like forever, but the slack is meaningful. Nylon strong, but it has a tendency to absorb water, which adds weight and makes a trekking pole tent structurally unsound. I don't overstate it because like people are using it forever and like nobody's dying and all this kind of stuff. But it is a climb.
Yeah. Well, I see it all the time with tents that I have that are nylon. Like even if it's not raining, if it's just a little bit higher humidity in the air, like I can see the sag starting to happen with them. So I've definitely seen that before.
And then a freestanding tent, it's like a little less critical because it's not part of the structure. Like your poles it's just a skin on the tent, but it's still like the fly will sag and like stick to the inner, and it's not as comfortable, things like that. Other nice things with nylon though, it takes dyes really well. You can get like rich colors, but it does also have a lot of stretch. So there's like it expands and sags and it stretches. And then polyester. So this is what we use for the X-Mid, and somehow I became the spokesperson for polyester because like I just looked at it and I was like, yeah, I can't have my fabric like expanding and sagging and being loose. So like we went with it, and we were not at all the first ones to do it. It's just that partly I think I'm just like very involved online, so I end up kind of defending it. But then also the X-Mid just got so big that there's kind of the tent that was known more for polyester, even though like we weren't the first to use it or anything like that. So for a couple of years, I was like the spokesperson for polyester, and it was contentious, and everyone's like at each other. Now I think, and the argument back then was like, if it's so great, why isn't like everyone else using it? And I think we've seen a lot of that improve. Like now we see like many more companies like Black Diamond, Tire Pretend, Yama, Six Moon Designs, like even like Nemo's doing like 50% polyester now. Like a lot of, it's not like dominating, but it's enough companies that it's legit.
So like, even Mountain Equipment Co-op, like they've told me that they won't make a tent anymore that's not made with a polyester fly.
Yeah, so that's awesome.
Yeah, and they're not as big as some of like actually they might be one of the bigger of those manufacturers. So that was cool to hear from them.
So yeah, polyester has two awesome advantages, or a bunch, but the non expanding sag, it's instead of 4%, it's about like 0.02. Like it's almost nothing. And then it also has less stretch. So the actual fibers, if you tugged on them, they wouldn't have much stretch. So when you have a fabric, your tent's a stretchy fabric, your tent's gonna in the wind kind of do this a little more. It can buffer forces, but you don't need too much of it to do that. It just kind of evens things out. And if you have a lot, your tent's just waving in the wind. Downsides to polyester is that it doesn't take dyes as well. You get more like pale colors, which is pretty trivial. We're talking aesthetics.
I think a lot of companies are moving towards like undyed fabrics or like low dye solutions anyways. So
yeah, and it hasn't been an issue. Like this fabric here, it's this a beautiful green or gray green, and nobody's gonna be like, no, I need a little more richness. Anyways, so the main knocks on polyester is that it's weaker, and this is just so hard to get an answer on. When you go to DuPont, who are like a chemical company, they make the fibers. They have like their technical specs. They don't list any difference. They say polyester is 1% stronger.
And when you say weaker, like in what aspect of something that like tear or like tear resistance, or
listed as like tensile strength, which is kind of like tear. I think when you have a fabric, you call it tear strength because you're like tearing the fabric. When you have like a fiber, you kind of pull it till it breaks.
Okay. Yeah.
Elongation spec, which is like your stretch, and then it breaks, and it's like the force required for that. So your tensile strength. So supposedly it's lower. It's so hard to say because it's like the chemical companies don't say it's lower. We do tend to see it being a bit lower in the fabrics, but there's, as I mentioned, there's so many variables, and we'll get into that it's like it's hard to really tie it back. It could be lower, but it's like it's not drastic. We're talking like 10% or something like that.
With all the X-Mids on the market, like I think it's how many years has it been since the X-Mid was released?
4 years.
4 years. So yeah. in that point of time, there's probably been a lot of use in some of them. And like have you seen the strength of the polyester in that fabric being like a weak point or like a failure point in any of the tents?
We've only had a few hundred blow up in the wind. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I've never just seen like it got windy and shredded the tent. I've seen the fabric was like rubbing on rocks and got a cut. And there was one spot where we didn't have much reinforcement. I saw one tent ever broke at that reinforcement edge. Never just like a pure rip. It's a big topic. Everyone gets passionate about tear strength. The counterpoint is that when nylon expands, because your bonds are stretching out, it's getting weaker. So it actually is 5 to 10% weaker when it's wet. So if it's a storm, it's probably wet. Even if nylon's like 10% stronger, is it in the field? And then there's UV, which is like, that's the other big thing. UV, everyone tests like fabric when it's like dry and new and inside. And then your tent's like 2 years old and you're in a storm and it's wet and all these other like environmental considerations are happening. Your tent could have lost like 50% of its strength from UV. It happens quicker than you would think. So if one resists UV better than the other, then even if one started off 10% better, it could be like way stronger. If it dropped 20%, the other one dropped 50, it totally could be the other way around. And UV is a complicated one. I don't even quite understand it. The general wisdom is that poly's a lot better for UV. The actual like test results are like pretty variable, and some do great and some don't. And so I'm still trying to understand that myself.
Yeah, we might have to chat about that later, because I think that's an interesting topic, because the tents are in UV a lot of the time when they're in use, and if we're seeing different levels of degradation, then that's going to affect things quite a bit. I think like anecdotally, like my experience with tents failing, like with like kind of just that like open panel just rip, it's been on a tent that's 10 years old, that's been in a lot of sun, and then it just gave out. And I think that's probably due to a lot of that due to UV damage.
Right, you probably get UV and then maybe like a little trigger point, like a little nick, and then it goes from there. And then the third fabric, Dyneema, it looks great. Like, so this is the fiber Dyneema. It's way stronger than either of those, neither poly. Like, it's kind of almost seems silly to debate nylon and poly when there's like nylon and poly and there's like Dyneema. You know, it's like you're splitting hairs here. The Dyneema fiber's great. It's super strong. It's near zero stretch too, kind of like poly. So that's great. And then you could like weave it into a fabric, and we can get into a bit more like fabrics and stuff, but I haven't seen as much information on it in terms of like some of these secondary considerations, like how well does it dye? I know you can get some dyed versions of it now, and I think I hear it's better for UV, but I've never seen test results on it. But if it is better for UV, then it's like stronger, no stretch, good for UV. That's kind of probably your big three for water fiber. So those are kind of the pros and cons of fibers. And then there's like the fabrics.
Yeah. And I think, like you're saying with Dyneema before, like because it's being used for sails, a lot of they're getting buffeted by the wind. They're in UV, probably getting wet. So I think a lot of the benefits that we see for sail manufacturing, it's going to apply for tents as well. So it makes sense that the fabrics do well for tents. And I think that was an interesting summary of like the pros and cons of each of those fibers. And I think, like you kind of said, then getting into the fabrics and how and how the different fabrics for tents vary. I think you mentioned a bunch of them, a bunch of different factors that affect fabrics and how they perform. Are there key ones that we should be looking at for tents?
Yeah. So I'll go through like kind of some main ones and some small ones. So like big one, I don't even know how to say this word because it's all online. So I say denier, which it's the word, it's spelled like denier, like climate change denier, but you spell it. I think you say like denier, everyone, but then I know
that's how I get told. I used to say denier.
Some people say
denier.
I
was corrected to denier, and yeah.
that's the size of the thread. So the fibers are into the threads, and then these are the threads that are woven into the fabric. It's a really obscure term, or it's a common term, but it's a really unusual measurement. Denier is if you took 9 kilometers, like 9,000 meters of thread, it's how much it would weigh in grams. Why do I have to ask, like, I guess like you're probably trying to weigh it doesn't weigh anything. It's like, it's too light.
9,000 meters.
9,000 meters of this stuff. All right, now, because like a 20, 30, like 10 fabrics are all like 15 to 30 D usually. So like 15 to 30 grams for like 9 kilometers of the stuff. Just tells you how thin it really is. So that's a huge factor. So you'll always see like when you get information on a fabric on the tent website, it'll probably just give you that number. Let's say D, like 20D, 30D. All you really need to know is that like a bigger number is a heavier thread, like a thicker, heavier thread. And that's going to be like a backpack might be a 200. The lightest wind shirts can be 7 to 10, and a lot of tents are around 20 or 30. So yeah, if you're comparing, that's a big factor. Like that's a way bigger factor in strength than the fibers. So denier is a big one. And then another big one is the coatings. So this is for tents. You got to make it waterproof because just the fibers woven together aren't going to be waterproof. You can put on a bunch of different coatings, which are normally either silicone or polyurethane, polyether urethane, and polyester urethane. So there's kind of three. We'll call them SIL, PU, and PE. They all have different properties. SIL is more elastic, and it allows the fibers. I mean, again, this is like the conventional wisdom. What everyone says, like nobody's like looking at this, and while the wind is like, oh yeah. But the conventional wisdom is that like a PU coating holds them very locked into place, and that makes it easier to rip. Kind of like if you're tearing fabric at like a fabric store, and you're gonna like run the scissors through it, you like hold it tight. That way your scissors are hitting like one thread at a time, and you can go. Whereas if it's loose, it kind of bunches out on the tear. And the same with like SIL, it can move a little bit. So it's kind of like allowing it to like bunch up and things like that instead of being held as like firmly in position. That's generally why SIL is, a lot of people like SIL. It's also very, so SIL's like inorganic. There's kind of some new talk now about how it's good for UV because UV really affects organic things a lot more. So if your outside coating is SIL, it can kind of protect the fabric. And so this is why, like, you could talk about the UV performance of different fibers, but actually maybe what matters more is like the coating on top of them.
Yeah. And is that what, like, have you used or like tested the Nikwax like UV protection? Is that what's kind of happening there? It's putting a coating of silicone or something on there. It says it also helps with waterproofing, so I imagine it's maybe a silicone based thing.
I don't think it would be silicone because it would totally kill breathability. Silicone like completely kills breathability. I don't think the Nikwax is doing that, but it would be some other thing that is also. Yeah, I don't know. So for fabrics, there's UV coatings. So silicone is a waterproof coating, and it might have some UV benefits. But there are like pure UV coatings that mountaineering tents use. There's like this titanium dioxide is the main one. I don't know much about it, but they put it on like really expensive mountaineering tents, and it just like completely like it's drastic how much better it is. So there's those. But for like a main fabric, we've got like the denier, we've got the coatings, you've got thread count's a big one. Even for like the same size threads, the same denier threads, you could weave like a really tight lot of threads, or you could have this like loose weave essentially. Loose is never good, but it'll be lighter. The problem with the loose weave is things are just going to move around more, and your fabric's this is where a lot of the stretch comes in. There's always going to be a little bit of stretch in the weave just because all the threads are going around each other. But if this is your weave, on the diagonal, you can really sometimes stretch. Just like if this shirt, like if these are the threads, it could be pretty taut either way along the threads, but like diagonally, there should be like, you kind of see it like pucker. You're pulling the weave, and the same with tent fabric. So that's called bias stretch, just diagonal stretch. And that's kind of always a bad thing because it just does weird stuff. And that's why a high thread count's nice. And you will sometimes see thread count specs. Like MSR might say 20D 400T, and the T is thread count.
Okay, and I think we see that a lot with like see that more with polyester tents. I was never quite sure what that meant. Like you'd see like a 300T polyester. Like I think Nature Hikes tents, they talk about their nylon tents with denier and then their polyester tents in thread count.
Okay, I haven't looked at their tents too much, but those things kind of go together because if the denier's big, you're not going to have as many threads. They're like big coarse, so there's going to be a few of them. And then if it's a tiny thread like silk or something, we should make silk tents, but it is.
Yeah.
It's tiny, and you're going to have more of them. So you kind of like need to know like for for a 20D, what's the normal range? So like a 20D might go from like 3 to 500. So then you could look and you could see, but like a 70D is never going to be like 3 to 500. It might be like 150 or 200. So thread count, and then there's a bunch of like kind of secondary things. Well, there's like ripstop. That's just like a grid of bigger threads. There's calendaring, which is kind of melting the fabric. You roll it through like hot presses. That's what you'll do on like a sleeping bag usually, because you don't want the down to get out and it poke through. So that you're kind of sort of lightly melting it.
So that tents that doesn't happen too much, the calendaring, or do we see that in many tents?
It's always hard to really know what's going on because I talk to like the tent factories and they get it from somebody else and there's like translations and stuff. But my understanding is there's not, calendaring is largely a sleeping bag or like wind shirt thing. You do it too much and you kill the breathability. So there's a trade-off there. And then you've got some other like minor coatings, like I mentioned the UV coating, there's fire retardant coatings, there's like water repellent coatings, which you wouldn't have on a tent fly, but you might like on the interior part of the tent. So there's a lot of factors, and that's why some of the main things are just like to actually understand what is making a fabric good or bad. It's like a little overly simplistic to just be like, oh, this one's polyester, it's like 10% stronger, when there's like 10 other things that affect that.
Exactly, totally. And when you're looking at the fabrics for the X-Made, like like relative to now, like if you had to say your knowledge, like let's go back to like maybe even like further, like when the X-Made was kind of like a twinkle in your eye. Did you have an idea that polyester was the way you're going to go, or were you kind of you were looking at the different fabrics and you kind of were just going to see what's out there, like, and what if you're at 100% knowledge right now, which you're definitely, I suppose, like relatively it's probably pretty close, but where was your kind of like understanding of those different factors back then?
Yeah, so I like pretty low. I was like a super geek, like maybe 2005 to like 2013. I hiked the PCT in 2014, which was great, but I was like hiking the whole year, so I wasn't really researching. And then I did my master's, and I was just so busy with that, I wasn't like geeking out too much. And then we did another hike in 2017 that was where I thought of the X-Men. So I had actually been like a little bit out of the loop for a couple of years on fabrics. I didn't even really know I hardly knew, I heard of polyester, but I hardly even know about it. Right when I was designing the X-Men, I was talking to a friend who was actually like, at the time, like geeking out pretty hard. And he was like, you should check out polyester. If it wasn't for that conversation, it probably wouldn't have been polyester, but he kind of like planted the seed, and I was looking into it and I was like, oh, that like makes a ton of sense. So then we did it. And then at that point, like I've been so immersed in it ever since the last kind of 5 years that it's way higher now. But it's one of those things where the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And I used to have a simplistic understanding where I was like, oh, polyester is, it's 10% stronger, and like you do this coating and you lose 4%. And now you're like, oh man, this stuff's complicated. And like, no, I'm a little like less inclined to make like really hardline statements about like, this fabric's always good or bad, or UV is always good, like all these kind of things, which makes it hard for the layperson, because you're like, well, if there's all these factors and Dan can't even figure it out, then like, what's a regular person to do? But I think what you know is like polyester is not going to sag, which is going to be nice, and it's not going to stretch, which is nice. And then I wouldn't get too wrapped into strength, because people overly obsess about it and it gets dramatic. But for strength, if you just kind of look at the denier, like a 20 or 30, like a 20 or 30 is going to be like a 10 there any day. That's often like your biggest factor is the denier.
And then for the coating, how important is the coating? Because I think I've read some interesting things on your website. If people want some of this deep dive, but in text form, I think your website has some awesome learnings at durstongear.com. But I think that with those three different coatings that we talked about, silicone, PU, and then PE, how important are those coatings for the tent fabrics?
Yeah, so they are important. The reason silicone would just kind of be what everyone uses, except that you can't seam tape it, and everybody wants a seam tape tent because it's just good to go, and you don't want to get a tent and set it up and have to dry it out. So what we do is we do sill on the outside. It gives that, I like to think it gives a bit of a UV protection, but we don't need to seam tape on the outside, so we may as well use sill. On the inside, we use a PE. PE is just replacing PU. PU the main problem, it's also hydrophilic. So this is really your big problem with nylon tents is the nylon's hydrophilic. It wants to absorb water, and the PU is. So water just wants to come like right in. And then the PU hydrolyzes, like breaks down. You can't even dry the tent that well because it feels dry, but it's like absorbed into the molecules. Or
It is that like other tents I remember, I think back to the tents that I had like 20 years ago where you'd store them and then like you'd take them out and there's like the seam tapes like coming off and like there's like weird delamination type stuff. Is that due to like the PU coatings that were being used back in the day?
yeah, that's PU. It's like a hydrolysis, like water splitting. It's just water damage because you think you dried it and you didn't because it felt dry and it was internally still had some water absorption, and then it just like degrades and then it's goopy or peeling or it's a mess. So the industry's moving away from PU. Like nobody would really say PU is a good thing. Like big companies like MSR have all switched to like over the last few years to PE. It's pretty good. It's not going to be as strong as Cell, but it is not also. This is one of the ones where I'm hesitant to put numbers on it because there's a lot of different information out there flying around and you hear everything. But it seems like Cell is the strongest, and then PE is pretty good because at least it's going to last a long time too. Not quite as strong, but still like strong enough, and you can seam tape it.
Yeah. So you use you guys use PE on the inside, silicone on the outside. And is it, like, are there any other companies doing that? Because I think when I've been looking at different places, usually it's just one kind of coating or the other.
Yeah, I think so. I'm getting a little above my knowledge, but my understanding is that it's hard to put two different coatings on a fabric because you need to like impregnate them, and they might actually be kind of like oil and water where they don't go together. So you like impregnate them at a very precise level. So it's easier if you just like do everything on PEPU. And I hesitant to make an argument of like people do it that way because it's easy and cheap, because it's also like this lazy argument that everyone like it got leveled against polyester where it's like, oh, it's just cheap, and it's like,
Yeah.
Well, if it's better and it's cheap, like that's awesome. Like
Yeah, exactly.
it's not actually like it's kind of like this. It's cheap, but I think anyways, we use the two coatings. There is some other. I think you are seeing that more in premium tents. And then there's a subset of companies that are passionate about like sill. They're like generally your smaller companies appealing to like a very kind of enthusiast fringe who are all happy to seam seal it. And then they're like, we got a slightly stronger tent, but we have to seam seal.
Like as far as those other factors that are affecting fabrics, is there anything else? Like, is there kind of like is there a sweet spot based on like the trade-offs? Because I imagine like there's the trade-offs you kind of mentioned before with like cost, weight, strength. Is there like what's and you mentioned the trade-offs between kind of silicone and PE as far as like seam sealing being the big one, but what about with like denier and thread count?
Yeah, like so denier, like it's just going to get heavier, and so that's tricky because if you look at it from a like kind of a fear-based perspective of like, I don't want my tent to blow up in a storm, then you just keep going up and up and up and up, and you don't have it grounded in like, what do you actually need? And a lot of the times, like you end up in this like overkill thing. But for denier, like a bigger number is going to be stronger. Most people are like 30 is going to be like lots. We do 20. I think that's like fine. It doesn't have like kind of a bit of overkill that 30 does, but it's like fine. And then like 10 or 15's like getting a little more niche. Like you might want to be thinking twice if it's going to be a big storm or something like that. So that's denier. Thread count, I probably wouldn't, like for a layperson, I probably wouldn't really think about it because it's a pretty small factor.
Is it usually just related to the denier? Like they just could kind of just like for tensor fabric, at least they'll just kind of pack in as many threads as the denier allows for like a tight weave, or?
I don't know like why you wouldn't always just, my guess is that like higher is better. It's going to be more what they call dimensionally stable. Like it's the bias stretch and all that. If you pack it tighter, it's just going to hold better. But if you did pack it loose, you might save a little bit of weight and a little bit of cost. I don't know for sure that's why they do it, but the lower ones, that would be my guess. And then, so for like the layperson, I would look at polyester and nylon, but not for like strength and things. I would look for like sag, really. Like that's, I think, the big one. And that's why we use it for a fly. denier is probably your best indicator of strength. And then for coatings, I would just avoid PU, which you're seeing really, it was on like all tents 5-10 years ago. Now you're seeing it mostly on cheaper tents, just because that's what's mass produced and easy to get and everything. But
yeah, I based on my experience, I don't think I'd ever buy a PU tent again. That's what failed first on all of my old tents, and I've never had fabric rip on me other than after like 10 years of sitting in the sun. So I think UV seems to be the other factor that, based on my experience, has been a pretty major factor after.
right, we might see get more attention. Like we might, because it's such a big strength factor that nobody talks about. Everyone's just testing new dry material. I mean, that could be something where some company like comes up with a UV coating that's awesome and puts in a lot of effort to educate people. It's hard to educate people, but you could. And then maybe everyone would start to demand that, and then everyone would do it maybe.
Yeah, I think we probably need to see less innovation with tents. Like right now, people are probably replacing their tents before they're hitting the lifespan of them in a lot of cases. And so it's hard. We don't see as many tents that are 10, 15 years old kind of out in the field as much anymore, I don't think.
Yeah, totally. And that could be something too, where you get into this, like you lose sight of what you really need, and you're just like, more like, I want the highest performance, and you put this coating on. And especially like backpacking, if you're packing up early in the morning and setting up after dinner, the UV dose is like so much less than it is in the middle of the day that it could, depends on your use, but it could really not be important. The one other thing that people should be aware of is fire retardant coatings, not really from a performance perspective, but from a health perspective. I think, so there's two sides to this. Some people get really like, oh my goodness, these things are like going to give everyone cancer. Like they're super bad. There's some legitimate like arguments that they're bad, but at the same time, like your sofa, like the chair I'm sitting in, like your pillow, like everything is doused in them. So your tent is probably actually not like a big contributor in your overall dose in your life, even though these chemicals are pretty nasty. We've stopped using the fire retardant coatings. I think everybody would, but there's like some regulations. Anyways, it's illegal. We have a whole legal podcast no one would listen to.
Yeah, the legal requirements for fire retardants in niche tent fabrics.
It's complicated and messy, but yeah, that's a consideration. Some people are worried about it. I think probably, keeping in context, it's not that big of a deal, but we're still trying to not do it.
Yeah, that's fair. I think the fewer chemicals, like probably the better if it doesn't affect performance of anything for the most part. And yeah, so I think that was a good kind of deep dive into the fibers and fabrics. Are there any other aspects of like I think it'd be neat to bring it back to maybe kind of like just with the X-Mid, as far as just like, do you see the X-Mid right now? Because I know you've done a ton of research into the fabrics and fibers. Where do you think it's kind of in the sweet spot right now, or is there a direction you'd like to see improvement with the fabrics and fibers? And like you said, kind of maybe as you talk to the fabric mills and are maybe able to like design kind of your perfect fabric.
Yeah, so there is some possibilities. There's like some like stuff we might be able to do in the next few years, and stuff that's like further down the road. In the next few years, one big thing is we've been talking about nylon and polyester, like they're like defined things. There's different formulations of nylon, like nylon 6, nylon 6.6, nylon like 6.3, like anyways, there's a bunch. And same is true for polyester. My understanding is there's only like one formulation of polyester that's really commercialized. There are polyesters in the lab that are like 3 times as strong. And there's probably no reason that you wouldn't use them other than that they just haven't been commercialized. And, to convince some huge $50 million factory that they should switch their process to make, So anyways, I don't know that those are going to change, but those are considerations. But what could happen in the next couple of years is there could be seam taping technology for silicone coatings. 3M makes some tapes now that they say stick to silicone. Nobody's doing it commercially, but it's not that hard to do, I don't think. If you could seam tape silicone, then I think everyone would just use straight silicone on both sides of everything. That would make it slightly stronger, and then we could maybe drop like the 20D to like a 15. So we might be able to get a couple ounces up the tent or something like that. That's going to be in like the next few years. Nobody's ever done it. Like it would be a real push, but maybe it could happen.
Have you started conversations with like factories about that, or is that kind of like you're getting your ducks in a row before going to them and you're like, hey, let's look at this?
There is, so there's like the tape, but it's like you could actually use it like how with DCF you will bond that, like basically use a double-sided tape to like stick it together. You could actually potentially do the same thing with like silicone fabrics. You could make a no-sew tent, which would be really cool. It wouldn't even really be seam sealing. You'd just be like overlapping the panels and sticking them together, and there would never be like thread holes to seal in the first place.
Oh, cool.
So I've seen that from 3M. Like I've seen the tapes. I've never heard of them like used, other than Dutchware released some tarps where they were like no-sew tarps. It was just one seam on the ridgeline. I think it was the tape they're using. So I think it's possible. It's just like sometimes the tapes don't save weight because it's like the adhesive's a little bit thick, and it's like 3 grams per meter, and then you've got like 12 meters on the tent, and it's like there's 50 grams of like goop that actually weighs more than the thread. So that's potential innovation, would be like seam taping still and going to like no-sew tents and stuff. No-sew probably sounds cooler than like it actually is. Like sewing's working totally fine.
Yeah.
And then like way down the road, we haven't talked too much about dynamic composite fabric. I mentioned the fibers are really strong. And then I would love to see those fibers woven into a woven fabric. The problem with it is that they're really strong. So if you just made the same kind of size of threads, it would just be like a normal fabric that's way strong. And it would be cool, but it would be just drastically stronger than you need. So to really take advantage of it, you need to go to like 3 denier or something like that.
Okay.
And then you make it like super thin, and then it's got like normal strength, and now it weighs way less.
Yeah. Because right now they do like just a really loose weave with the Dyneema in order to provide strength, and then they, like you said, they sandwich it in between like a film.
They don't even weave it at all. They have a production process. It's all like they still hand make it. It's on a roll. It's not even on a roll. It's on like 9-meter chunks. They make it in like 9-meter chunks. That's part of it. So they like artisan stuff.
Yeah.
But they lay out the fibers down the length of that panel, and then like people lay out so there's like down the panel, and then across the panel, people lay out the fibers in like these bundles, 1.5 foot at a time. So the fibers are just laid out. So they're woven together. They're just laid there, and they're laid very loose, which lets you take advantage of the strength, because if you took those fibers and you weaved them, there'd be so much more of them. It would end up being a lot heavier. You take advantage of the strength, you space them out. It works pretty well, but you still have weight in like the adhesives that glue it all together. And there's a bunch of like, I like dynamic composite fabric. It's really cool. But it does have some downsides like puncture resistance, because they're just laid there and you're kind of just puncturing the Mylar. I don't think it's as good for floors. A woven Dyneema would be at like a 5 denier or 3 denier. It could be like, just like hands down, just like it's just better at everything.
Do you know what the denier is of the fiber that they use, or the thread? I guess the thread that am I getting that terminology right? The thread that they use for the like current Dyneema that they're laying over top of each other. Do you know what the denier of that is?
It would be a fiber, because it's just like, I think they extrude it like I think they have like a head that like spins, and it's got the special goop in it, and it spins, and they're like coming out holes and drying, and you're getting these filaments coming off. Anyways, they're like filaments. They lay them out. They're insanely light. Like they might not even be 1 denier. Maybe they're 1, but they're like, but then if anything else you buy with Dyneema is like, you can't find it less than about like 30. I don't quite know like what's going on there, but as soon as you get like, if you look at pack fabrics, there's the Ultra 200, which is Dyneema composite. The 200 is like not too bad expensive. The 100 jumps up another $10, and I've talked to them about like, what about like a 50? And they're like, no, the price is like 4 times. So instead of like $40 per yard, it's like $200 per yard. And I guess there's a commercialization problem with these like small threads, and that's why that's the problem with a lot of this stuff. It just comes back to commercialization, like new polyester formulations, seam taping sill, woven ultras. They're all pretty cool things that just might never happen because nobody wanted to drop $1 billion to kickstart it.
Yeah, and I guess like we talked about right at the beginning, like the tent industry isn't big enough to be pushing a lot of this right now unless it can be done like in an affordable manufacturing way, I guess, right? So
Yeah. So that'd be interesting just to learn more about it. I don't want to get too into the weeds because there's the danger you get like so fixated on like some of these things when you're like, you step back and you're like, they're all working pretty good right now. Nobody's dying. Like,
yeah, I think we're in a good age of, as far as tent fabrics and innovations and weight goes, we're in a pretty good spot. Like 20 years ago, like some of the tents that we're seeing right now and the designs, it's pretty cool to compare. So it's, yeah, I think do you have any kind of, I think we covered off some of the future, and we talked about the past and where we are now. Do you have any other kind of closing thoughts around tent fabrics? I think maybe just summarize again, kind of like you kind of talked about just what people should be looking for when they're looking for a tent. Kind of the main points there.
yeah. So I would say like, don't get too worked up. Like if you love a tent, I wouldn't like not buy it because the fabric's not exactly right. But the main points on fabric would be polyester has that nice non-sag, as does DCF, which are better. And then durability, I would mostly look at denier, and I would avoid PU coatings. Basically, is the gist of it. And then, yeah, I would not get too worked up about like, oh, this one's 15 denier and this one's 20. Like there's a difference, but in particular perspective.
Yeah, I think maybe when we're in the extremes of like 7 denier fabrics or like 7D denier fabrics, then it's a bit of a different story, especially once we get to those heavier ones. They're quite heavy. But yeah, when we're in like 15, 20, 30, it seems like it's not huge differences. So yeah, that was great. Thanks Dan. And I know I learned a lot. And I kind of come into these just being dangerous enough to kind of know that there's a topic that should be talked about without actually knowing anything about the topic. And I think even just the difference between like fibers and fabrics, I think has been kind of a game changer for me in how I interpret those, and then the other factors that affect those fabrics really kind of changes my kind of perspective on the tents. And then just bring it back, because I think, like you said, it's easy to get into weeds, easy to kind of go a little bit too far down the rabbit hole with some of these things. And it's sometimes you take a step back and be like, this tent is going to work for me. It'll be light enough. It'll be strong enough, and I'm going to have fun with it. And that's really, really all that matters.
Yep. Let's get outside, get camping.
Yeah, exactly. So if, I think I mentioned before, but like DurstonGear.com, anywhere else you'd want people to go check you out?
People can check out, we have an awesome group on Facebook called Durston Gearheads. We just have some rad fans, so we really appreciate kind of the people that just like are stoked on our stuff. It's spread the word. Like a big thanks to, I'm just super appreciative to those people because they've made all this happen. Like we don't advertise, we don't marketing budget. It's just kind of me with a bit of help. So the fans are awesome. I just want to give a big shout out to thanks to those guys.
Yeah, they're cool. I remember when I joined that group, I was just blown away by how passionate the people are, and it's in a healthy way. Sometimes cults can get a little bit scary, but the Durston cult's just a fun, welcoming spot. So yeah, definitely people should go check that out. I think you're in there a lot too, kind of providing advice and information. So that's always cool to see.
Yeah. Well,
so thanks, Dan, and I think we'll probably have to have a chat again about UV performance, UV impact on fabrics down the road. But in the meantime, have a good rest of your winter, rest of your day, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, thanks, Justin.